Now it's time for perspective on the programme, and Sudan is experiencing a starvation crisis of historic proportions, and yet the silence is deafening as people die of hunger. Now, those are the words of a series of humanitarian organisations in Sudan as they're calling on the international community to address the immense hunger crisis. Now, it's estimated that more than half of the population of Sudan is affected. Now, that's approximately 25.6 million people. All that amid the armed conflict that erupted in April of 2023. It has now raged on for approaching a year and a half. The war even spreading into the country's central, southeastern food production areas. Joining us now is Will Carter from the Norwegian Refugee Council. Joins us from Port Sudan. The council, an independent humanitarian organisation helping people forced to flee, currently working across 40 different countries. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme. Just tell us, first of all, sum it up for us about how bad the situation in Sudan is for people.
Thanks, Stuart. It's a catastrophic situation here in Sudan. You've got, as you say, almost half of the country and probably 2/3 of the country in dire humanitarian need, partly from the massive war that's going across the country in many key cities, including the capital, which is now a battle zone, but also this catastrophic hunger crisis, which has reached famine-like proportions in certain areas of the country. So it's a really brutal, really large-scale and complex situation in Sudan.
I mean, you mentioned the war there. Obviously, as I said, it's been going on for nearly 18 months. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any sign of it coming to any kind of an end, does it?
Unfortunately not. There's been a few efforts to try to mediate between both sides, and it feels like they've all stalled. There's still, somewhat of a push, but it's not really getting the right amount of international pressure to help, and neither of the main warring parties are really up to settle at this point in time. So our planning assumption is it's going to get worse, even in a best case scenario.
And bearing all of that in mind, what you just said there, how much are you able to do as an organisation? How much are your colleagues, other NGOs able to do? Is it possible even to operate in the country?
It is possible. It's one of the most difficult places on earth to work, but aid is getting through. In some ways from the traditional international-led approaches, in some ways from local volunteers, really heroic efforts in some of the worst parts of the country. I've seen myself a few weeks ago in Khartoum, which is an area which is at critical food insecurity and also in starvation. Communities banding together to run soup kitchens and help families in most need. But there's also work going on in larger scales. Our colleagues have perhaps helped almost 800,000 people across the country, which objectively is large, but in the grand scheme of 25 million people that need humanitarian assistance really isn't enough.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the situation would be even worse if you weren't there. But as you say, 800,000 out of 25 million at risk is the figures are stark, aren't they? It's pretty obvious that a lot more is needed.
Absolutely. And, comparatively, Sudan receives so much fewer attention than other crises and not just diplomatic, but also, financial support as well. France and had a donor pledging conference in Paris. It was partially successful, but still really quite meager in comparison to what is provided for Ukraine, for Syria, for Gaza. And Sudan is probably twice as large, if not more, of many of those contexts. So funding is a key issue that we need to increase. Of course, pressure to make sure that aid can get to everywhere that it's needed and that people are kept as safe as possible until this war finishes.
You mentioned, or I mentioned at the top there, the agricultural workers having particular problems at the moment because the war is spreading into areas where many of them operate. Presumably that could, make the situation far worse even.
Yeah, there's the situation right now, and then there's the situation in the next 6 to 12 months. The prognosis is very bleak. A month ago or so, I was in the east of the country in one of these agricultural areas, Gedaref, which was also hosting thousands of refugees from neighboring Ethiopia, from the Tigray region, which is also now on the front lines of this conflict after 2 or 3 other neighboring states had already been captured. So, Sudan used to export some food. Now it's desperately struggling to survive in terms of food imports, which aren't really coming through. So we've got the problem today and the problem next year, and of course the bigger situation with how food is produced inside Sudan.
How difficult is it to get the world's attention on this? I mean, we've spent the last half an hour, 45 minutes talking a lot about the situation in Lebanon, a lot about the situation in Gaza. We spend a lot of time on the channel talking about the situation in Ukraine. We do talk about Sudan, but not as much. And, at the same time, we've got all these politicians at the moment, world leaders gathering in New York. And I'm sure people will talk about Sudan, but perhaps not as much as these other issues. How difficult is that to try and overcome?
It's been extremely difficult, and I don't understand why, to be honest. Of course, I understand there's only so much airtime that can be given, but the same arguments don't apply for political and diplomatic attention and financial support in Sudan's hour of need. It's been really tough to grab attention. It was a large-scale crisis even before this war had broken out. Now it's probably the worst displacement crisis, the worst hunger crisis on the planet, and it's really beginning to threaten stability in the region and a massive refugee and migratory flow out of the country if this famine isn't stopped very soon.
So what would you say to those world leaders? What would be your appeal?
It's going to be a mark on our global conscience if they don't stand up for Sudan. It's much more feasible to get to have a positive change in the situation in Sudan. There isn't great power rivalries like some of the other countries in the world, and it's going to get much worse. So really, there's no time to waste in mobilizing and in escalating this. This is barely landing on the desks of foreign ministers, let alone presidents and prime ministers around the world, and it really needs to be at that level. 2 decades ago, when it was just in one part of the country in Darfur, it had celebrities, world leaders all coming to the world stage to demand an end to that violence and a solution. And now when we see a situation which is probably 3 or 4 times worse, almost no one is speaking. So there's no excuse. They have to step up the pressure and support and attention on fixing the situation in Sudan.
Good to talk to you on the programme today. Thanks very much for being with us. Will Carter from the Norwegian Refugee Council joining us there live from Port Sudan. Thanks very much.